Hey everybody, in today's video we're going to be comparing the Z mount 24-70 f4 against the Z mount primes. Right, so this is part 2 to part 1. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, I will go and link that somewhere around here somewhere. In this video, we are going to be comparing the 24mm F1.8, the 35mm F1.8, the 50mm F1.8, the 85mm F1.8 against the 24-70 F4. Are we going to get a loss of picture quality that outweighs the convenience that we get from carrying a zoom lens? That's what we're going to find out today. Obviously, a lot of people might say that a prime lens is going to be better because it offers you an f1.8 aperture, or it might be better because it's a prime lens and it therefore means that it's better designed at that focal length. I get that, but there are some people out there who have asked me to make this video because they want to know if the difference between the zoom lenses and the primes is big enough to justify carrying the prime lens as well. What we're going to do is we'll have the 24-70s shot wide open, then stop down, versus the prime lenses shot at their widest aperture and then stop down, so that they're equal at f4, f8. And I've added a few extra things into the test scene to try and add a bit more detail and a bit more variation of subjects. It still works for me. It's an easy solution rather than going out with all of these lenses and shooting kind of examples in the real world, and they also then wouldn't be consistent. So if we were doing a direct comparison, it'd be much harder with natural light and a natural subject, for example. So this for me works for me, and I hope it is still useful for you guys. Alright, so here we are for the first of many, and we're going to start with the 24-70 f4, obviously at f4 on the left hand side, and then the 24mm prime wide open at f1.8. Obviously we're going to shoot them both wide open, then I'm going to stop the 24 prime down to f4 so they're in the same ballpark, and then we'll go on from there to see what they look like as well. So let's go take a look, see what we can see. So here we are at 1:1, and they pretty much look identical in terms of kind of sharpness and detail. What we can quite clearly see is the huge difference in terms of depth of field. So we can see straight away that f4, we can read these digits in the background on this lens here, whereas on the 1.8 we can't do that because obviously at 1.8 the depth of field is thinner. We start to move around the frame, we can see where other areas fall out of that 1.8 depth of field, but other areas at f4 are sharp. But in the middle, in terms of kind of detail, at 1:1 they're about the same. So let's go to 2:1, see if we can notice a difference. Okay, so straight away we can see that the f4, the 24-70 f4, technically, even though it's at f4, it is technically still wide open, is sharper than the 24mm prime when the prime is at 1.8. I am expecting that to change drastically. As soon as that prime starts to stop down, I'm expecting it to get much sharper than the 24-70, but the question is, how much sharper does it get? Yes, the extra light that you get by shooting at 1.8 is an advantage, but by the looks of it, there's a little sacrifice in sharpness. And remember, keep in mind, we're at 2:1 here, so realistically, everyday shooting, probably not going to notice that difference. If we go quickly back to 1:1, we can see that they're almost identical, really. You only really start to notice that difference when we go back in at 2:1. So for me, it'd be a hard call between these two lenses. The 24-70 f4, maximum flexibility, but does not let in a lot of light, but still a really good performance in terms of sharpness and detail compared to a prime lens. Let's stop the 24mm prime down and see what happens then. Okay, so here we are, 24-70 f4 on the left at f4, and 24mm prime stop down to f4 on the right. Same shutter speed, same aperture obviously, same focal length, same ISO, same camera. So let's go take a look. We're here already at 1:1, and there's no real discernible difference in picture quality, sharpness, even moving towards the edges of the frame. I think maybe at 1:1 the 20mm prime is looking sharper than the 24-70 zoom is. Yeah, but 1:1, it'd be tough to call between them really. And here we are now at 2:1, and this is where, as I mentioned earlier, I expected the prime to kind of really sharpen up. So because we've stopped the prime lens down to f4, it's a couple of stops away from 1.8 now, we're in a situation where it is sharper than the 24-70 f4. And you've got to give the 24-70 its due. Because it's still at f4, it's still technically wide open, and it is softer, but it's still not a massive amount. And bearing in mind, we're at 2:1, so are you going to notice that in real world photography? Is that difference in sharpness going to give you major differences to your picture quality? It comes down to your photography. Obviously, if you're a landscape photographer and you want the sharpest, most detailed landscape shots you can get, that prime lens is going to be better than the 24-70 f4. So down here, we can clearly see the difference in sharpness. So what we're going to do now is we're going to stop both lenses down to 5.6, and let's take a look to see what they perform like at f5.6. Okay, so 24-70 f4 on the left at f5.6, and the 24mm prime also stopped down to 5.6 on the right. We're at 1:1 here, and as with previous examples, there's really no way of telling a difference at 1:1 between these two. Even kind of in the corners, they're pretty much identical. So I'm just going to jump straight into 2:1. As you can see at the center of the frame, they are identical, even at 2:1. Realistically, we can see here in the corners, there is a slight difference between them, and I think the 24mm prime takes it in terms of corner sharpness, whereas the 24-70 f4 just looks a little bit softer, little bit softer. But again, we're still at 2:1. So, what does that mean for you and your photography? Should you buy the 24mm prime? Should you just stick with your 24-70 f4? I think it comes down to what you're going to shoot. If you're in a situation where you're going to be stopping that lens down and you're going to be shooting at f8, f11 landscape type stuff, then the 24-70 f4 is going to be good enough, I think. Obviously, there's going to be a massive advantage from that 24mm prime when you're shooting low light because of that 1.8 aperture. It's going to let so much more light in. So we're talking astrophotography, nighttime events, in a situation where your ISO can be much lower because of that 1.8 aperture. And it's going to give you shots that the 24-70 f4 cannot. But you might not be doing things like that. You might not be doing low light photography. Okay, so here we are at 35 millimeters. We have the 24-70 f4 at 35 millimeters on the left, and we have the 35mm 1.8 prime on the right. The 24-70 is obviously at f4, and the 35mm prime is at 1.8. They're both technically wide open. Remember, we're going to stop that prime down as well, just like we did with the 24, just to compare to see how these lenses are at the 35mm focal length. So let's go take a look at 1:1. As we've come to expect, here we are at 1:1, and there's very little difference straight off the bat. It kind of sums up really the same experience that we had with the 24. We're in a situation where at 1:1, and if you're not cropping into your images, you're not really going to see a huge difference between these two lenses when they're both wide open. We can obviously see the huge difference in depth of field, but what I'll do is I'll just go to 2:1, have a quick look at 2:1, see what we can see from there. Here we are at 2:1, and yeah, the 24-70 f4 is still sharper. Now remember, it's technically still wide open at f4, but the 35mm prime is at 1.8. I would expect that 35mm prime gets much sharper very quickly as soon as you do start to stop it down. But right now, when it's wide open, it's only a tiny bit softer. It's only a tiny bit softer. And again, it's going to come down to, do you want that flexibility of the zoom, or do you want that massive advantage that you would get from being able to shoot at 1.8 in low light situations? You might not shoot a lot of stuff at 1.8, so it depends on your photography. I'm only showing you what these lenses perform like in this very particular situation right in front of me. I would say that towards the edges, the 24-70 f4 does just appear to be that little bit softer. The 35 prime just appears to be a little bit sharper towards the edges. Okay, so here we are. Both lenses are now at f4. So the 24-70, the 24-70 f4 on the left and the 35mm 1.8 on the right. Let's go take a look, see if we can see any difference. So again, at 1:1, very little difference between the two in the center of the frame. At the corners, the 35 prime is a lot sharper, but at the center, it's definitely very difficult to tell the difference between the two at 1:1. Have a quick look at 2:1. At 2:1, I'm probably going to give it to the 35 prime. So as we would expect, stopping that 35 prime down does make it sharper than the 24-70 f4. One thing I'll also mention here as well is that it appears that the focal lengths are different. You can see that the 24-70 looks more zoomed in than it does on the 35 prime. You can see the focal length on the right hand side here in Lightroom. So they're both registering at 35 millimeters. However, the camera's in the exact same place. The lens mount and the sensor mount is in the exact same place. So this would effectively be a real world difference that you might see between these two lenses. Focus breathing can affect angle of view as well. So there's a couple of different reasons as to why that might be caused, but just keep that in the back of your mind. So what we'll do is we'll stop them both down to 5.6 and we'll take a look from right, so 24-70 on the left, 35mm on the right. Both lenses stop down now to 5.6, and they are pretty much identical. If I had to choose one, I'd probably say that I prefer the look of the 35mm prime. It looks a little bit more contrasty. Obviously, all the settings are 0. I've not done any editing to these images, but it looks a little bit more contrasty, and it looks a little bit more sharper at the center of the frame at 5.6 at 2:1. But these are very specific differences. I would really have to, zoom in or really kind of nitpick to see this in the real world. Quick look towards the edges, and we can see that, as I mentioned, the 35mm prime is sharper at the edges of the frame compared to 24-70 f4. So again, if the whole frame is important, then yeah, the 35 is going to be the way to go. So for most people, I think the 24-70 f4 is going to be good enough, and it really comes down to, if you really like that 35mm focal length, then the prime is going to be better, as you would expect. But I think most people are going to be happy with their 24-70 f4. Okay, so here we are at 50mm, 24-70 f4 on the left and 50mm 1.8 on the right, the f4 at f4 and the 1.8 at 1.8. I've come in straight away at 1:1. We kind of already know the story about the 50mm 1.8. We know that it's one of the best lenses, even when wide open. So at 1:1, there's not a massive amount in there, but I do just feel like the 50mm 1.8 just pops a little bit more. It just seemed to have that extra bit of sharpness, even at 1:1. A little bit more kind of micro contrasting colors, and just, all around just a bit more of a pop to the lens. Now we'll quickly go have a look at 2:1. So at 2:1, again, the 50mm 1.8 just looks like the sharper lens, even when wide open at 1.8 here. But we've kind of come to know that that's the situation. The 50mm 1.8 was the only prime that was able to really stand up to the 24-70 2.8 when it was wide open. So I think the real telling thing here will be, can the 24-70 f4 match the 50 when they're both stopped down? So we'll stop them down together. I'm going to skip both lenses at f4 because the 50 is just going to get sharper anyway. So what we're going to go with two is we're going to go to both lenses at 5.6, see what they look like then. Okay, so here we are, both lenses stopped down to 5.6, 24-70 on the left and 50 on the right. We're here at 1:1, and there is very little difference. The 24-70 f4 is definitely sharpened up because we've stopped it down one stop to 5.6. And I think, for most people, this is going to be very telling because we know how good that 50 is. The 24-70 at 1:1 gets very close to that. So for most people, it is going to be just a really good lens. That 24-70 f4 is going to be a really good, sharp, detailed lens in the center for most people. But keep in mind, it's not going to give you that flexibility to be able to shoot at 1.8. Towards the edges, the 24-70 f4 does get a little bit softer, and you can start to see that take effect. 50mm prime retains a lot of that sharpness and detail, whereas the 24-70, even at 1:1, we can start to see just starts to drop off in the corners, where the 50 prime just holds strong, as we've come to expect. But here we are at 1:1, and at the center, it's difficult to see the difference between them. To 2:1, though, that does change, and even though we've now stopped the 24-70 down, it just never catches up to that 50mm prime, just showing you how much sharper that 50mm prime is. So as I mentioned in the 24-70 2.8 video, that 50mm prime is still one of the lenses that I will always have with me, because picture quality wise, it's just so good. For most people, and for those of you that are never going to look at 2:1, that 24-70 f4 has done a lot better than I thought it would against this lens and against some of the other lenses as well. It's just not as sharp in the corners. Right, so here we have the 24-70 f4 at 70mm. Then I readjusted the camera's position and used the 85mm lens. So there is going to be a slight difference in position and distance to camera. Tried to get them as close as possible. There's a slight difference between them, so please excuse me for that. Hopefully you'll accept the fact that they'll show you just enough detail between the two, or enough distance between the two, just to give you an idea. Obviously they're not the same focal length, they're not the same lens, but on the left hand side 24-70 f4, and on the right hand side we have the 85, both wide open, so the f4 at f4 and the 85 at 1.8. We're here straight away at 1:1, and there's very little difference between them again, really. It's more about the 85. It's just kind of giving me something a bit more contrasty, just looks a little bit more sharp around this area here. But the 24-70 f4 at 70 is still doing really well. Obviously this is at the center of the frame, so we're going to take a quick look at the corners, and moving towards the edges. Yeah, we can see even at 1:1 that the 85 retains a lot more sharpness towards the corners, even at 1.8. Whereas the 24-70 just loses that softness towards the edge. We can obviously see that clear differentiation between the depth of field, because obviously that lower depth of field, that shallower depth of field caused by shooting at f1.8. So let's have a quick look at 2:1. So here we are at 2:1, and they are very similar. I would really struggle to choose between the two. Obviously the key thing to keep in mind is that that 85mm lens is wide open at 1.8, so it's letting in a ton more light, means that you can use that lower ISO, you can get that better picture quality, or a faster shutter speed if you needed a faster shutter speed. So do keep that in mind. But currently, right now, even at 2:1, it's hard to tell the difference between the two. So what we're going to do is we're going to stop the lenses down, see how they perform then. Okay, so here we are, both of them at f5.6. So we've got the 24-70 on the left and the 85 on the right, both stopped down to 5.6. We're here first of all at 1:1, and again, it's very hard to see the difference between them. If I had to choose one, I feel like the 85 maybe, ever so slightly, but at the center of the frame, it's really hard to tell the difference. And again, that just kind of goes to show that I think for most people, they are going to get some really good stuff from their 24-70 f4, but those primes are just going to be a little bit more flexible in some areas. We'll take a quick look at the corners, and then we'll look at 2:1. So as we start to move further out away from the edge of the frame, you can see here that the 24-70 is already just getting softer than the 85 prime. And then when we get right over to the edges, yeah, that again, the 24-70 is just softer compared to the 85 prime at the edges of the frame. So we'll take a quick look at 2:1, see what the difference is. So now we're in at 2:1. We can see that the 85mm lens is sharper. It is the sharper, more detailed lens, which is kind of what we would expect. Again, as we start to move away towards the edge of the frame, the 24-70 just starts to lose some of that sharpness, whereas the 85 retains that, and then right towards the edge, the 24-70 just gets softer, whereas the 85 remains nice and sharp. So I think it is all going to come down to how much do you need the edges of the frame. Realistically, for kind of an 85mm focal length, if it's portraiture, you're not really using right to the edges of the frame. Not as much as you would do with like a 24 or a 35 prime, but At the center, they're very close. They're very, very close. It's just you can only shoot to f4 on one of them, and the other one you can then shoot to 1.8. So it's definitely an interesting comparison. I've definitely been really surprised by actually how well the 24-70 f4 has held up against the prime lenses. I wouldn't say it was ever really better. It was at least matched them in most cases. And across the board, and if I was going to generalize what we've just kind of gone through, I think at every focal length, quite clearly, in the center, they're similar, the 50 and the 85 being noticeably better. But at the edges, that's where the primes really shine. As you would expect, the 24-70 f4 gives you massive convenience, but it does just start to drift off towards the corners, and you're just not going to get that same sharpness and detail at the edges of the frame like you would with the prime lenses. So it's definitely not as close as the 24-70 2.8 was against the primes. That was really difficult to try and choose. For the 24-70 f4, you are getting that bonus added feature of the fact that it's smaller, lighter, easier to carry. And across most cases, it does give you really good picture quality. It's just towards the edges that it starts to fall down. So in those instances, that's where the prime lenses are going to be better. And obviously being able to shoot at 1.8, so low light, lower ISO, or a faster shutter speed, you can just take more light in from the lens. And you know, there's going to be those types of photographers that say they prefer to shoot with primes because it makes you think differently about your photography, and I'm all for that. So hopefully this has just gone some way to show you the difference between the lenses, you know, which prime you want to buy next. But for me, the standouts are the 50 and the 85mm prime, whereas the 24-70 f4 does a pretty good job across the board. Thank you very much for watching. Please do subscribe if you haven't already. I've got a lot of interesting things on the way. Goodbye.